we are very happy to have with us. It's Professor Vishanthie Sewpaul from KwaZulu Natal University of KwaZulu Natal, Durban, South Africa. And you can say a lot about her. She is a very active woman, known in many continents, and not the least within the international organizations of schools of social work. And we asked her to contribute today because she's just come out with a new biography where she writes about her interesting life. You can read from the presentation of the book that one person's narrative as they intersect with geographies of space, race, gender, class, caste, religion, spirituality, sexuality, emotions, family, friends, and colleagues. And she writes about her shift from wholes to wholeness. And that really caught our interest because, as you know, PowerUs has been working with experience-based knowledge, especially enhancing the experiences of the service users, but to an increasing extent, also recognizing the complex lives of social workers and students and teachers. And we therefore really welcome you, Vishanthie, to share with us today. So warm welcome. And what I will try to do as you start to speak now is to pin you as I don't know if you see me now. I think you do.
I can see you, yes.
Great. So I will.
Although I'm the kind of person who likes seeing a few faces on the screen while I'm talking.
Well, it's good you do it in advance.
Yeah, okay.
So very well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Firstly, I want to say congratulations to all our colleagues on PowerUs. I told Cecilia that the worldviews of PowerUs are in complete synchronicity with my worldviews, so I feel like quite at home here. So Cecilia is talking about, the arc of our paths that's just been published. In many ways, I think this book has been in the making most of my adult life. And what prevented me from doing that was fear. Fear of looking at oneself in the mirror and fear of confronting one's own darkness. So I had to, I think, go through what is called a Kensho moment, a painful moment in my life that made me confront, I think, my distorted sense of invincibility. And that came with my COVID-19 groundedness. I'd been traveling and teaching quite a bit, and in January, February, I was in Lisbon and then the Seychelles, returned home to COVID and all its restrictions. I was supposed to go to Norway, but I couldn't. And then I decided I would make that long overdue call to my cardiologist for that diagnostic angiogram because I had quadruple bypass surgery 10 years before and I should have had it before then. And I actually went there, feeling, I'm feeling great. It will be no problem at all. Only the results of the angiogram really made me confront my mortality, as did COVID around me at that time, because what we were seeing was the spectre of deaths across the world. So, I think COVID was a huge kind of catalyst and the confrontation, as I said, with my own sense of mortality. So I begin the book with a chapter titled Writing in the Time of COVID, May 2020. And I must tell you that the sense of urgency in writing the book was such that the entire thing was completed within 10 weeks. And then I wrote a postscript in September 2020. So the first chapter introduces issues around structure and agency, free will and destiny, synchronicity, power, vulnerability, and human suffering. And these are threads that permeate the entire book. Chapter 2 goes into the heart of the memoir, where I talk about my family roots and family dynamics. I talk about trauma and abandonment and losses, and how this impacted on my sense of self and particularly those of my family members. But against this, trauma and fear and abandonment, I talk about the importance of reclaiming our power. And I talk about my mum, who was the central arc in my path of growth and development. Chapter 3 takes us to my growing up under apartheid and the micro-macro links and its historical trajectories. And I talk about growing up under apartheid, from both a political and personal dimension, as my mum was a domestic worker who worked for whites. And I go on to describe my days in high school and how social work found me and the moments of synchronicity that I experienced with that. And I talk about ways in which I got to get to university against this background, and again, the people that constituted the arcs of my path at that time. I go on to discuss my journey as an academic in apartheid South Africa and the shift in university from going to an all-Indian ethnic university that I was allowed to under apartheid to entering what was historically a white university, and the trajectory that took me in terms of widening my scope of interest in social work, education and training and into the international arena. I actually discuss quite a bit my worldviews in relation to Vedantic and Zen Buddhist philosophy of mindfulness, living in the present, living not for the fruits of action, but for action alone, and how these are actually measures of success and mastery, as is the willingness to speak truth to power. I must say that although it is a series of highly intense personal narratives, it intersects with my core kind of academic interests as well. So there's a chapter there, where, I do talk about personal life in relation to marriage, infertility, moving into marriage in good faith of it lasting a lifetime, and the multiple kinds of losses that one experiences when this kind of ideal is shattered. And within that context, I discuss confronting infertility and how we dealt with it, and particularly my occupational hazard of involvement, which I'm sure all of us in PowerUs will identify with. But I think the compassion derived out of that involved engagement contributed to one of the greatest gifts of my life, and that's our adopted daughter. And quite a bit of the memoir deals with her and our journeys together as mother and daughter. And I deal with the very difficult issue of telling and how I negotiated the trauma of telling in adoption. There are 2 interlinked chapters there that have direct bearing for social work, education, training, and practice. One is on difference and diversity, and the follow-up chapter to that is on emancipation and liberation from pragmatic and spiritual point of view, and with the focus being on compassionate and reflexive dialogue, and more importantly, freeing ourselves from the constraints of our own thinking. So yes, I confront the 3 giants that we experience in relation to what impacts our work with education, practice, and research, and that's the triad of neoliberal capitalism, new public management, and science of the logical positivist tradition. But I argue that underlying these giants is the more obscure giant of the enemy that exists between our ears, our self-limiting and self-sabotaging beliefs, and our taken for granted assumptions. I move on to talking about life, illness, mortality, and immortality. And again, I discuss, I think, very personal experiences, with illness and death. but I contextualize that against more philosophical notions of life and death. And in the last chapter, the epilogue, I go back to talking about writing in the time of COVID.
Good morning, Jill.
May 2020. And this chapter connects with the first and all the other chapters in between. And there I reflect more on the political dimensions of COVID-19 in relation to how COVID-19 is actually exacerbating existing inequalities and power imbalances, with the fissures of the social fault lines based on race, class, gender, class, and nationality running very deep, even though COVID-19 is tearing asunder even advanced economies of the world. I reflect on meaning making and the possibility of a world that may be different, in the post-COVID crisis period. So yeah, that's what the book is about, but you're free to ask questions and I'm willing to answer them.
Thank you very much, Vishanthie. We could listen for much more time, of course. And
but I'd rather be more interactive than.
Yeah, okay. So just before we let people ask questions, we have 5 minutes for questions now. I just want to ask you, where can your book be bought? It's on Amazon, is it?
It is on Amazon. Unfortunately, I don't know if you know the politics and economics of publishing. Mm-hmm. Those of you who have your books on Amazon, it's the first time I self-published. So usually it's the publisher that deals with everything, but it's the first time I'm dealing with it on my own. With the book being on Amazon, like for $44.99, I was given 6 cents. So when we talk about neoliberal global capitalism and why some people get to be so rich, I mean, Jeff Bezos is worth $185 billion US. And quite honestly, I think it's theft.
So just if people want to order your book, the name of it, you can mention also. The name of the book is?
It's, you can't see it with this. It's called The Arc of Our Parts.
The Arc of Our Parts.
The Arc of Our Parts. I can write it into the chat.
Yeah, that's good. So please, all of you listeners, go. If one of you wants to ask a question, you just unmute yourself and put on the camera, and then Vishanthie will be able to answer a question now.
Vishanthie, and I make.
Hello, Colin.
Please blow. Vishanthie, that's fantastic, and the book sounds wonderful. I have a couple of students this year who, for their dissertations, are going to be developing autoethnography, looking at how their experiences are structured in relation to class, to the structural issues of class and gender and ethnicity and disability. And I'll make sure we get your book into the library because it sounds such an important resource for that learning. It sounds fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you. One of the questions that I've been asked is about the title, The Arc of Our Parts, Growing into Wholeness. I must say that the title evolved. When I saw the cardiologist, and I confronted my distorted sense of invincibility and my mortality, I just started writing. And that's how the book, much of the book felt like it wrote itself at the end of it. It just poured out of me. In fact, I actually couldn't stop once I had started. And it just reminds me of Nelson Mandela's word, it always seems impossible until it's done. But I always say, it always seems impossible until one begins. So it was the beginning that was the most challenging for me. And people were saying, oh, but you're writing the book, what's the title? Oh, there you can see the title now, right? And the title evolved. It was like from some inner part of me as I wrote the book. Because I started writing, I think, for my own healing, because writing is actually a very powerful way of communicating with oneself and with other people around you. And I think initially it was for my own healing, but also for the healing of my family members. You know, I described trauma in chapter 2. But as I wrote, I think I realized the book was bigger than me and my family. So the arc of our paths is that metaphor where people can see their own arcs, you know, through the ups and downs of my life. And I think the message by the end of it is that it's not where I've come from that matters. It's where I've come to and who I've become through the processes of writing and my unfolding. That's the most important. And yeah, I think it is a message in that way of hope. So Colin, yes, I think the stories here applies, I think, to anybody